So also, if you haven't come across Bible prophecy in particular before, you might say, well, what is this concept of Bible prophecy about? Well, there's an example given for us, and you can either turn it up or it's on the screen there for us, in the book of Isaiah in the Bible, a fairly significant major prophet in the Bible. And in this particular section, God makes a claim about his ability to predict future events. And the prophet speaking here in Isaiah chapter 46 verse 9 says, "Remember," this is God speaking through the prophet, "remember what I accomplished in antiquity," or in ancient times. "Truly I am God, I have no peer. I am God, and there is none like me, who announces the end from the beginning and reveals beforehand what has not yet occurred, who says, my plan will be realised and I will accomplish my desire." So in this particular section of Isaiah, God is making a claim. He's making a statement that he is unique. He says, I'm God and I'm the only God. There's no one else like me. And in particular, that's because I have an ability to predict future events. Not only do I predict them, but essentially the God of the Bible is stating that he outlines them and then makes them happen. So he says, my plan will be realised and I will accomplish my desire. So God is saying, I can outline the future in prophecy, and I can also coordinate world events to make that happen. I don't just sit back and watch. So with that background, what we want to look at today is that there is a lot of prophecies in the Bible, about some of which have been fulfilled in the past and some of which are in the future. What we want to consider in particular are called latter-day prophecies in the Bible. So what are some examples of latter-day prophecies? Well, we had one read tonight by Andy in Ezekiel chapter 38, and we're going to come to that a little later. But first of all, I'd like to take you to one in the book of Daniel, another significant prophet, Daniel chapter 10. So if you've got a Bible, or we do have some quotations on the screen there for you, we'll go to Daniel chapter 10 and explore this, what's termed a latter-day prophecy. So, just taking a verse, we're going to spend most of our time in Daniel chapter 11, but just to make that connection to the term, the latter-day prophecy, you'll see in Daniel chapter 10, verse 14, that the person speaking to the prophet Daniel, who's giving him these visions, says in verse 14, "I am come to make thee understand what shall befall thy people," that is, the people of Israel, "in the latter days." There's our phrase. "For yet the vision is for many days." So we've got this, the latter days, and then when we come to chapter 11 and verse 40, we are skipping over a section of the prophecy here to go to our point of interest. But this continues on through chapter 11, and we come to verse 40, and he calls it there the time of the end. "At the time of the end, the king of the south shall push at him." So I appreciate we've jumped in there without context, but what we're picking up is this is called an end time or latter-day prophecy. What we're going to find is latter-day prophecies are those that are relevant to the time we believe we are living in or very close to. So without doing a deep dive into these prophecies, because we don't have time for a full exploration of it, we just want to pick out a few key themes and say, what are the themes, what are the key things we see happening in these latter-day prophecies? So if we read there from verse 40 to 42, we have a discussion of two entities, you might say, the king of the south and the king of the north. So let's just step through that. It says, "At that time of the end, the king of the south shall push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." So we've got a description of two powerful entities battling against each other. Obviously the prophecy is written in the terms of the day, where they use analogies of horsemen, ships, chariots, and so on. You can translate that to today's terms to tanks, warships, planes, and so on. But the equivalent applies. So we've got some great battles and a big invasion happening. And so this king of the north is the one that is said to appear to have the greater force, and he is overflowing down into other countries. So he's invading sovereign countries. Verse 41 says, "He shall enter also into the glorious land. Many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape." All right, so what are some features? And we've got some just highlighted on the screen there for us. We've got a leader of a territory that's in the north. Now, appreciating a lot of Bible prophecies are written around Israel. Israel is the people of this prophet Daniel, and it's written in context of that. So when we talk about King North and the King South, it's with reference to the land of Israel. So we have a leader of a territory north of Israel who is leading a huge invasion. The invasion ultimately comes down to the land of Israel. Now, you don't see Israel written there, but you see in verse 41, the glorious land. Now, in the eyes of God, the provider of this prophecy, Israel, described in the Bible as his people, therefore the glorious land, or the important land to God, the author, is the land of Israel. So it's clearly saying he's going to come into the land of Israel. And you can see there clearly some lands adjacent to Israel: Edom, Moab and Ammon. Ancient names, but other countries on the western side, or eastern side I should say, of Israel. And it's described he's going to go all the way through the land of Israel down to the land of Egypt. But we'll come to more of that detail in a moment. Take for the moment simply that we have a large invading force coming from the north down through the land of Israel, also capturing some adjacent territory, and coming down to the land of Egypt. But it describes at the end, this invading force will come to his end. So it says in verse 45, "He shall plant his tabernacles," or pitch his tent, as other translations say, "between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him." So, despite having a huge invading force and overflowing, as it describes, through this territory, in some way, this invading force is going to come to his end, as the prophet says. All right, so that's one latter-day prophecy, and that's the key features of it. So do we find this anywhere else? Well, yes. Considering the prophecy we looked at tonight, and you can turn back there if you've got a Bible handy, Ezekiel chapter 38, when we go through, we're going to find some similarities, some parallels between this and that prophecy we just looked at in Daniel chapter 11. So we've highlighted the same colours on the slide there, the key elements that we find in this prophecy. So we've got, in the first few verses, an entity called Gog identified, and we'll talk about him more in a moment. But he's identified as the leader, again, of an invading force. We're going to skip down to verse 8 just for the time being, and you'll see that this leader gathers his invading force, and he's going to come against a certain land, verse 8. It says, "After many days thou shalt be visited, in the latter years, thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword." So we're in the latter years. We know we've got that same connection. It's a latter-day prophecy. And he's coming to a land that's brought back from the sword, gathered out of many people. And he zooms in on it now. It is specifically the mountains of Israel, which have been always waste, but it is brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely, all of them. And with reference to Israel there, it's notable that in terms of the sweep of history, it's only in the last century, in the 1900s, that Israel again exists on the map as a country. Prior to that, it was vacant, or certainly not populated by Jews, but inhabited by many other transitory peoples. But this invading force is going to come against the land of Israel, it's saying, a land which has been recently repopulated, re-established as a state. What are some other features? Well, verse 9 says he's going to ascend like a storm, like a cloud to cover the land. So similar language to that which we saw in Daniel chapter 11, overflowing. So we're talking about the magnitude of the invading force here, the way it's unstoppable, it seems, in its volume and its speed. And what about the end of this this event? What's the outcome? Well, the same outcome's described here in verse 18. Slightly different terms, but it says here, "It shall come to pass at the same time when Gog," this leader of the invading force, "shall come against the land of Israel, saith the Lord God, that my fury shall come up in my face. For in my jealousy and in the fire of my wrath have I spoken. Surely in that day there shall be a great shaking in the land of Israel." So it goes on to describe God's response essentially to this invading force. Just skipping over to verse 21, he says, "I will call for a sword against him throughout all my mountains, saith the Lord God. Every man's sword shall be against his brother." And finishing in verse 23, God says, "Thus will I magnify myself and sanctify myself, and I will be known in the eyes of many nations. They shall know that I am the Lord." So the outcome is that this invading force again is destroyed, and it becomes evident that it's God that carries that out, and everyone knows that God is Lord in the earth. So that's just a skip through some of those key prophecies. We're just trying to identify what a latter-day prophecy is and the key features of it. A large invading force from the north, invading the land of Israel, going through to Egypt, and being destroyed completely in the process. Just recapping there. So, who are some key players in this event? Can we identify them? So, if we go back to the first part of Ezekiel chapter 38, which we skipped over for the time being, it outlines there a number of different countries, but some of the names obviously are unfamiliar, being written several thousand years ago. The names of countries and peoples and territories have changed over time. Some of them are still recognisable, and others are different. Now, we're not going to go through an in-depth demonstration or historical proof of the translation of all these names to modern-day equivalents. We'll look at one or two just for example. But what we've got on the screen there is just a explanation in terms of the modern-day territories, what these countries that the prophet Ezekiel is referring to translate to. So if you look at starting with verse 2, the prophet says, "Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, and prophesy against him." So we've got the land of Magog, Meshech and Tubal. Chief prince, better translated Rosh. We'll talk about why that is in a moment. So we've got these countries, Rosh, Meshech and Tubal, which can all be identified approximately within today's modern-day Russian Federation. Coming down to verse 5, he also mentions Persia, Ethiopia and Libya with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Verse 6, Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all his bands, many people with thee. So we can identify more players here. Persia was called by that name not so long ago, but today called Iran. Ethiopia incorporates today both Ethiopia and modern-day Sudan. We've got Libya, also known as Put, which encompasses territories of Libya and Algeria today. And Gomer, in verse 6, became called Gaul. You might recognise that term if you're familiar with the historical reference of Asterix. But Gaul really incorporates Western Europe today, including France and Germany. And then the House of Togarmah, finally, can be approximately equated to modern-day Turkey, also north of Israel. So this person, Gog, all right, who could this be? Well, this is not a real name, first thing to point out. It's a symbolic name or a title, a little like someone might use Pharaoh or Tsar. It's a title or a position as opposed to a person's name per se. It simply means the meaning of the name, which is used in Scripture for a real person elsewhere in a different context, simply means high, supreme, a high mountain. So we're talking about a powerful person or being. So Gog's the symbolic name of a nation's leader, and Magog is his land. He's of the land of Magog. Chief or Rosh. Now, I pull this point out only because it is debated by some scholars, and there's if you were to look this up online, there is various debates about whether chief prince, as it's rendered here in the King James Version, should indeed be chief, simply a leadership title, or it can be equated to a proper name that's Rosh. We've got a quote there from Justinus, who's a well-respected scholar in the Hebrew language, and he states clearly that Rosh in this case, which is the core Hebrew word, line chief, should indeed be translated as a proper noun, and he states that it is a proper noun referencing a northern nation mentioned with Meshech and Tubal. In his opinion, undoubtedly the Russians, who were mentioned by the Byzantine writers of the 10th century under that name of Ross. So the appropriate rendering to get the grammar right in that verse, and it's rendered this way by a few other translations, the ASV, NKJV. Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech and Tubal is a clearer translation. So what about Magog? Now I said we're not going to go through detailed backgrounds on all of these names and how they translate. We'll just take Magog as one example, and then we'll put the rest on the map. So Magogites have been identified with the Scythians, who moved north to Georgia and southern Russia, and from there to Central Europe. Some references there from two historians, Josephus and Herodotus. Magog founded those that were from him named Magogites, but who are by the Greeks called Scythians. So there's our connection to the people, the Scythians. And Herodotus tells us that the Scythians, north of the Black Sea, were between the River Don in Russia and the River Danube, Central Europe. So fairly expansive territory. We're back. Sorry about that. Back on track, hopefully. All right, so putting what we just discussed on a map, quickly you can see the northern area, the regions or the nations we mentioned, or the references in Ezekiel as Rosh, Meshech and Tubal in the region of Russia, Magog there, Central or Eastern Europe, and Gomer, Western Europe, Togarmah in the region of Turkey, and Persia down in modern-day Iran, Libya and Ethiopia, as you can see in northern Africa. So what about putting the events on a map? So we're getting back in our Daniel 11 reference. You can turn it up, or it's there on the screen for you. This gives us a bit more detail than Ezekiel 38 in terms of the actual movements of this, what we could call Russian Confederacy, that's stated by Ezekiel to be invading the land of Israel. So this king of the north, who we've now identified as Russia, because Gog is of the land of Magog and Rosh. So he's coming against him, and in this case he comes down firstly against the region of Turkey, like a whirlwind, with chariots, horsemen with him, and many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overthrow and pass over. So you can say there's a land invasion and there's a sea invasion, because we're also told that he's coming with many ships, right? So he comes down from the north, from that Russian region. To get there, you have to go through the territory of Turkey, most likely pass down there through Syria, Lebanon, and then finally overflow into what it terms the glorious land, or the land of Israel. He then continues on, it says, to the land of Egypt. So we've got the arrows going down there, initially pausing in Israel, but pushing on to Egypt and occupying that territory. So it appears he's going to pause in a moment in the land of Egypt, but then there's going to be some other troubles that will change his direction. And you can notice there, in parallel with what we saw in Ezekiel 38, the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. So those countries in northern Africa supporting his invasion. But we're told in Daniel chapter 11, one verse that we didn't focus on before, verse 44, that tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him, that's trouble this invader who's now occupying Egypt. So therefore he shall go forth with fury to destroy, to utterly make away many. And that's when he goes and plants his tabernacles, it says, between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. So it's referencing the glorious mountain. It's back in Israel. He's heard some tidings that concern him out of the northeast. And you can see Israel is northeast of Egypt. And so something has happened there which has disturbed him. And he's heading back up there to do some damage by the sound of it. He's going forth with great fury to destroy, to make away many. So the Jews that are remaining in the land, though no doubt some of them have suffered through the first invasion, but those who are still intact in Jerusalem and the surrounds, they're facing complete destruction at this point, as Gog, this leader, and his Russian force and allies heads back up to make complete destruction now of the land of Israel and Jerusalem. So what happens? Well, we're just going to recap then what's happened, what's in terms of the players and the movements. So we've had a military alliance forming, led by Russia, including Iran, Ethiopia, Libya, Europe, and Turkey. We've had a land invasion coming down from Turkey, entering Israel, a sea invasion through the Mediterranean, continuing to Egypt, and then returning to Israel to counter what's not described here, but some unknown force which has disturbed him. But we know the end, he's defeated there by the intervention of the God of Israel, and the nation of Israel are saved from this invader. So what is it that happens at that point? Well, it's described in more detail, wasn't it, in Ezekiel 38, as a time where God is angry. It says in terms of God's response that his fury comes up in his face, and that he fights against this invader in Ezekiel 38 verse 22 with pestilence, with blood. He talks about overflowing rain, great hailstones, fire and brimstone. So it sounds like all the forces of nature are turned upon this invader. But also we're told, and we're not going to turn there now, but God's intervention will happen by the Lord Jesus Christ returning, supported by his saints, his believers, with a large force, and essentially crushing the invading force of Russia and its allies and saving the remainder of the land of Israel, the Jews that still live there. And so God's intervention is, yes, both through the forces of nature, but also by sending his Son back to the earth. And this is, of course, a dramatic event which the world has not seen the like of before. Direct intervention by God in this way in the affairs of the nations and the events on the earth. And so this is going to not only be a major event in terms of a battle and a war, but a world-changing event which is going to commence a new age, you might say, a new world order. And that's why we find this particularly interesting. Because as Bible students, we're not just fascinated with war for the sake of war and battle. We find it distressing seeing the media and reports of all the damage and destruction that goes on as much as anyone else, and we're greatly saddened by that. We don't take any delight in war in itself. What we do look forward to and what we are encouraged by is the fact that there is a promise that there will be a kingdom of God established as the aftermath of this battle. The battles are, of course, part of the actions of human greed and human pride as nations seek to further themselves in their own interests, amongst other things. But God will carry out his purpose and will eventually turn this world to his ways, and that is what will bring true peace and security to this world. You can turn it up if you like, or we have it on the screen there, a reference from the prophet Isaiah that describes what it will be like after these times. It says there that it shall come to pass in these last days, so after these events, the mountain of Yahweh's house shall be established in the top of the mountains, and that out of Zion shall go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So we've got a time where Jerusalem will become an international centre both of worship but also of government, as the law and the direction of God goes out from Jerusalem. And he, that is Jesus Christ, as God's representative, will judge among the nations. He will rebuke many people, and they will beat their swords into ploughshares, their spears into pruning hooks. So That's the time described where people will turn their forces and their resources previously used for defence and war into agriculture and improving the situation for humanity. The earth also is going to be refreshed. We're told in other quotations, for example, Psalm 72, that the earth will be much more productive agriculturally and people will all be sufficiently provided for in terms of food, something which hasn't been seen for many years across the face of this world, where no one actually wants for food. So in terms of these, we've outlined what the Bible predicts is happening, but what should we see and how do we understand the events in the world around us relating to this? Is there a connection, and is there evidence in the events we see around us that what the Bible is predicting is actually happening? So just a couple of other features of the last days that I've put on the screen there. Other, what you might say, are signposts of the last days. We're told in the prophet Zechariah that Jerusalem will be an international problem. It's described there as a burdensome stone, or a stone that people can, cut or damage themselves on. It's like the hot potato, you might say, that no one can hold, no one can solve the problem of Jerusalem. There's widespread instability described in a prophecy in Luke chapter 21, given by Jesus Christ himself. He talks about there being signs in the sun, moon and stars, or in other words, governments, political powers, and on the earth or amongst the people, distress of nations. Describes this time of people's hearts failing for fear and looking for the things that are coming on the earth. And that's a sense of perplexity where people can't find a solution. And as they look forward to future events, it only makes them afraid. There's nothing particularly positive to see in the outlook for the world. And there's a sense of everyone arming themselves and putting a greater emphasis on defence arrangements. And we're going to talk about how that's relevant to today's situation particularly. Quotation in the prophet Joel says, "Proclaim this among the Gentiles, prepare war, wake up the mighty men, let all the men of war draw near." And you'll note it's a reversal of the other statement about swords and ploughshares. In the kingdom age, well, after Jesus Christ has returned, it talks about people beating their swords to ploughshares, turning defence instruments to agriculture. Before that, in the lead up, it's the other way around. So here people are turning their ploughshares into swords, so taking whatever resources they've got, even if it was really for agriculture or other purposes, and diverting that to instruments of war, because people are so afraid of what they see coming on the world. Everyone wants to arm and to prepare themselves. So what would we expect to see in the lead up to these events? Well, we expect to see a more militant Russia, wouldn't we, led by a dictatorial leader. You might say, well, do we see that today? Well, I think certainly the events since the invasion of Ukraine, early 2022, no one would doubt that we have an aggressive Russia and a dictatorial leader driving that. Now, we're not making any statements about whether the particular leader of Russia at the moment, Vladimir Putin, is the Gog, the leader described in Ezekiel 38. He may or may not be. He seems to fit the bill in terms of his drive to invade and take over other sovereign countries, no doubt. But whether it's him or some successor, we don't know. As we said, the prophecy doesn't name the individual, only the position. But if we were to say a few years ago, Russia would invade another sovereign country and take them over, most people would say, no, the world wouldn't stand for that. Well, the last events of the last 18 months or so have certainly proved that they are capable, or willing at least, to try that. Jerusalem as an international problem, definitely the case, and there's ongoing conflict between the Jews, other Palestinians in the land, and the international community always has something to say about Jerusalem and the division over who should own, who should control that city and the sacred sites within it. Increasing armaments among many nations. We're going to see that particularly in response to recent events in Europe, Ukraine, Russia, many countries are now turning their focus back to rearmament. An alignment between Russia and other nations mentioned in Ezekiel 38, such as Iran, Libya and Sudan. So we'll take a look at some articles on that as well. But we also expect to see, and this is something we don't currently see, this is a not yet point, is some form of cooperation between Russia and Europe. You'll remember in the prophecy of Ezekiel, Central Europe, Western Europe are part of the invading force. Now, at this point in time, no one could envisage Russia joining with the European countries who are currently backing Ukraine against Russia in the current war. It would be hard to envisage them joining with Russia for an invasion in the Middle East. But this is the thing. Many things in Bible prophecy in the past have seemed unlikely at the time they were predicted or at the time people observed them. But all we can say is what God says happens, will happen. And he has proved that through history in the past. So certain things we can see the alignment starting to come and you'll see those signs. There are other things where we say, well, not yet. The evidence is not there at this point, but we trust the prophecy. So we're not going to go into detail about the current war in Ukraine. I think that's well publicised enough by the media. But just some background that you may or may not know about it. As one article highlights, there's probably a number of reasons for the invasion of Ukraine by Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation. But one that may be less known is that there is, you might say, a religious motivation behind this as well as perhaps just a land grab of another territory which in his bid to increase the Russian Empire. But the person you can see pictured there is the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill. And he's one that's been preaching and actively supporting this invasion or war in Ukraine. And he says that the invasion of Ukraine is a metaphysical battle, or another word for a spiritual warfare, you might say. And that he talks about it as the church being triumphant in the end over Ukraine and bringing it back under its umbrella. And Putin is very closely aligned with this person. He's a very close advisor of Vladimir Putin. And so you can see that there's various motivations at play driving Russia to invade other countries and increase its influence. Well, we're told in Ezekiel 38 that there would be Iran as one of those key allies joining the invasion into the Middle East. And so that's something we can clearly see today in terms of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. They don't have many friends at the moment in the world, Russia, so the partners they do have, they're relying heavily upon them. And Iran is one of those who has been supplying Russia with equipment, particularly drones, in order to support their attack and their warfare in Ukraine. And so it says in this particular article, in exchange, Russia has been offering Iran unprecedented defence cooperation, including on missiles, electronics, and air defence. Ukraine has been alienated, you might say, from many other countries globally due to their nuclear program and other extremism which goes on in the country. Notably also, Iran believes that Israel as a state and the Jews should not exist in the land. It's part of their mission, you might say, to exterminate the Jews from the land of Israel and restore that to Arab control. So, in terms of a partner to be aligned to, for Russia to be aligned to, this is someone who would be absolutely willing to follow them on an invasion into the land of Israel and absolutely happy to help in a mission which might destroy the Jews. So, strong alignment there with what we see in the prophecy. Now, there were some African countries mentioned, which are perhaps lesser known features of this prophecy, but we had Ethiopia mentioned there, Libya. And as we mentioned, this encompasses the territories of modern-day Ethiopia, but also Sudan, Libya and Algeria. So, well, notably, since Putin and Russia have been facing opposition from the rest of the world, they don't have many other friends across the globe. They've been looking for the places to invest and to build up their alliances where people will support them. One of those places is Africa. And only as recently as just the end of last month, and in late July, a week or so ago, Putin particularly went to the effort of hosting a summit for African leaders in St. Petersburg in Russia. Had a 2-day summit there and reaffirmed his commitment to supporting the African leaders. They were particularly concerned, of course, about grain and the impact of the lack of grain on their countries now that Russia has essentially ripped up the deal which was allowing Ukraine, one of the world's biggest grain producers, to export grain through the Black Sea. Russia had allowed that to a point. They've now reneged on that deal. So obviously Africa, one of the receiving countries, is concerned about that. Putin promised, no, look, we'll give you free grain, that's fine. But he wants solid support from these countries. He also agreed to fight with them against neo-colonialism. So essentially, that's where he's describing the West as trying to control and manipulate other countries through their sanctions and other actions. He's saying, no, look, we shouldn't be able to be controlled by the US or Britain or Europe or any of these other Western countries. We shouldn't be manipulated and forced to act according to their will based on sanctions or other pressures they put. You and us, Africa, we'll work together and we'll push back against this. So, building up those alliances described here in Ezekiel 38. Ethiopia in particular, it was back in 2022, not long after the invasion of Ukraine, that Russia quickly reached out to Ethiopia as a partner, and the foreign minister from Russia met with his counterparts in Ethiopia in his tour of Africa last year. Notably, Ethiopia was one of those countries who abstained from voting on the UN resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine in March. So last year, the UN quickly raised a resolution to condemn this war, this invasion of Ukraine. The majority of countries supported that. So those that stepped aside were notable, and Ethiopia was one of those. What about Libya and Sudan? Well, this article from the Middle East Institute states that despite its rapidly deteriorating economic outlook and military stalemate in Ukraine, Russia remains committed to preserving its influence in Libya and Sudan. And so back in late 2021, Russia was currying favour with Libya's foreign minister, Bashar, to shore up its influence there in Libya. And in terms of Sudan, Russia has been negotiating with Sudan to establish a naval base on the Red Sea. It says that the naval base in Sudan could provide Russia with a foothold in Africa and the possibility of controlling crucial shipping routes in the Red Sea. So they can see there's interests there. A huge amount of the world's shipping goes through the Red Sea and up through there, through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean. Having a naval port at that point would be a great strategy for Russia, an excellent control point. And so you can see that Russia is trying to, while it has many players in the world against us, pick strategic points and other players who are sympathetic with it or who they can give something to and build up those alliances. We talked about the world rearming itself. So although many countries, although they might be sympathetic to Ukraine's situation, they haven't put boots on the ground. What they have, of course, been doing is supplying arms, but also rearming themselves. Now, there's a bit of detail in that article on the screen. I'm just going to pick out a couple of points, key points for you. It talks about the European Peace Fund, the EPF. Now, this was a fund previously used to support disadvantaged countries in terms of aid if the countries might be at war and so on. But the principle was always that they provided non-lethal aid. In other words, they didn't provide arms and military hardware to these countries to actually fight and attack others. That all changed the moment that Russia invaded Ukraine. And the leaders in Brussels who discussed and controlled this European Peace Fund immediately said, well, there's nothing else we can do if we're not providing lethal aid to Ukraine, actually providing them hardware and weapons to fight against Russia, then there is no hope for them. They'll be wiped out. And so that was a fundamental change in policy for the European nations. They would use this fund, which was often used for other peaceful purposes, even supporting agricultural industries and other things in disadvantaged countries. Now that was turned, you might say, from the ploughshare, from supporting peaceful industries, to buy weapons to roll into this war in Ukraine. And aligns with that quote in Joel chapter 3, where they're saying, wake up the mighty men, build up your war resources, and let the weak say, I am strong. So all the countries which have less military resources, the EU and others are pumping arms into them to build them up. And we can see that other countries on the sidelines are becoming concerned, worried as they look on Russia's actions to other countries. And so we have some historical changes happening. Countries which have been claimed to be neutral or stand aside from the NATO-Russia tussle over many years, over many decades, all of a sudden are very keen to join in NATO, in the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, because they are desperate to have that protection from what they see as an aggressive, increasingly aggressive Russia. And so only in this past 6 months we've seen a landmark event as Finland became NATO's 35th member state. And in the process, Sweden is now also set to join in alongside Finland and join NATO. So these are two Nordic states that have long maintained military neutrality, but that's all changed when they saw Russia's aggression in Ukraine. So, in summary, we've seen the Bible outlines particularly the major events and the major actions that Russia and its allies will take in the Middle East in a future invasion. Now, if you're hoping today to find out from the Bible what Russia's particular military strategy is in Ukraine and where they're going to move tomorrow, no, that's not what we're talking about. The Bible is painting the big picture and the long-term outcome. We're not offering opinions on particular outcomes in Ukraine in terms of will Russia be successful there at this point in time, will they take more territory tomorrow or not, or will they fall back. This is what you might say noise in the big picture of prophecy, but overall we can see the events are shaping up towards that picture described in Ezekiel 38 and Daniel chapter 11. And so what are the purpose of these things? Well, we can sit back and analyse them from a pragmatic point of view and say, well, that's all very interesting that we can see and try to understand what the events might be and what the future moves of nations in this world are. But there's little purpose in that unless it has some meaning and some relevance for us personally and affects our own actions. And so in the prophecy of Luke chapter 21, where the Lord Jesus Christ talked about these latter-day events, he left a clear message to those listening to him. He said, "Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." So also he said, when you see these things taking place, you know that the kingdom of God is near. And so I guess that's our appeal to you from this address. It's not just to interest you or fascinate you with the moves of nations in the world, but to say that there is a God who's written this Bible, we believe, and has a plan for this world that we live upon. And we'd like to share that with you. So we're very happy to discuss that with you going forward. Please reach out and to talk to us about the hope of the Bible. Thank you.